Vážené dámy, vážení pánové, já si dovolím zahájit další část našeho jednání. Ve skutečnosti jsme dostali se do toho bodu, kdy začínáme závěrečný panel našeho sympozia. Máme před sebou 3 poslední příspěvky. Já teď představím naše řečníky, udělám to v abecedním pořadí. Vedle mě je paní profesorka Shobhan Katago, jestli vyslovuji její jméno správně, je profesorkou na katedře filozofie Tallinnské univerzity. Vedle ní sedí Dušan Kováč, kterého aspoň my tady v Praze dobře známe, významný slovenský historik a mimo jiné kdysi ředitel Historického ústavu v Bratislavě a místopředseda Slovenské akademie věd. A poslední v abecedním pořádku, ale první jako řečník, Pieter Lagrou ze Svobodné univerzity v Bruselu, tedy z frankofonní Svobodné univerzity v Bruselu, a Pieter Lagrou přednese závěrečnou přednášku. Aha, tak prosím, co se děje s překladem?
Sorry? Thank you.
I don't know, does it work already or not yet?
Yeah, it works.
It works? Okay. So they say it works. Yeah, it's not for you. Okay. So they say now the translation is going on, so please, you can use it. Yeah. So Pieter Lagrou přednese závěrečnou přednášku. Tak, prosím pěkně. Does it work already? Or?
I thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to deliver this talk to you. And I am quite honored that so many of you have preferred to listen to a dull speech rather than go and have a walk in the sun in Prague in this beautiful afternoon. So I hope I won't disappoint you and that you won't regret having made this choice. So the title of my speech, as indicated in the summary but not in the program, is The Gospel of the Superiority of the Present over the Past, Reclaiming the Critical Potential of History 25 years after 1989. Well, let me start by a simple question. Why are we in this business? We, that is, social scientists, museum curators, documentary makers, educators, civil servants of the European Commission and of various national and regional governments, historians. This business, that is not just talking about European history in general, but about mass crimes committed in the 20th century. Now, we can make different claims why we are in this business, but probably not all of them at the same time. And let me list just a few of them. We can conceive of our work as that of social workers, alleviating the pain of the victims by creating spaces for their stories, by providing recognition for their suffering, admitted, that is, that there are still survivors around to be listened to, which is quite often not the case. And I think that the discourse of the generational transmission of victimhood is altogether a very different reality. It has to do with collective identities, with historical claims, but not, in the first place, with individual suffering. That's a first claim. A second claim can be developed under different headings, and it would be a very ambitious claim, posturing as the guardians of both the past and the future. That is what we are doing. And this can be expressed differently, and far too often we are quoting George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Now, that is a very strange affirmation indeed. As a historian, I'm convinced that history never repeats itself. Implicit in Santayana's phrase seems an idea of cyclical time. Time is like a turning wheel and the past eternally comes back. I do not think that that is a notion of time that is shared by most historians or even by all those who share some notion of modernity. Now, can we really seriously think, for instance, that World War II repeats World War I? And even if we would believe this, would this be because the contemporaries in the 1920s and 1930s did not remember World War I again, and this is why we got World War II? Honestly, I do not think that we can take this proposition seriously as a way to make our claim why we are in this business. Another way of making the claim is what I would call the categorical imperative of memory, in the French phrase, le devoir de mémoire. I would think that this is even stranger as a claim. Elementary psychology teaches us that forgetting is at least as vital as remembering. If you remember everything, you become insane. Memory is not ruled by obligation, it is ruled by selection. And I think that any observer of contemporary culture will agree that forgetfulness is an unlikely threat today. We are living in societies that seem obsessed by the past, obsessed by memory, and certainly not neglectful of the past. Basically, behind the idea of the memory obligation is also a very problematic representation. That is, somewhere there's a switch, and we can put the switch in one position, that is remembering, or in another position, that is forgetting. And there is no intermediate solution. Now, of course, that is not how memory works, especially in the public space. We are not faced with a mutually exclusive binary choice between remembering everything, forgetting everything. No, we are in a memory competition. We are in a situation where we give more or less attention to one kind of memory compared to another. Just think of this year 2014. Well, what should we be remembering mostly in 2014? Is that Sarajevo, 1914? Is that Warsaw, 1944? Is that Berlin, 1989? Or is it maybe Kigali, 1994? Well, we can do all of this at the same time, but at several points we have to make choices which memory we find more important. And this is not about forgetting Kigali or Warsaw or Sarajevo if we want to remember Berlin. It is about assuming the competition there is. So there is no categorical imperative of memory, but ultimately a normal political, and one could hope, democratic process of competition for public attention, for public money also, to build them, those memorials and those musea, to organize these lavish conferences as the one we are having now, to pay for the shiny smartphone applications, for the websites, for the oral history collections, for the books and brochures which we are distributing on public money, and finally also to be able to hijack high school students for some compulsory visits or readings. This is what this competition is all about. We can, of course, also frame this more generally under the heading of prevention. It is all about educating for peace and tolerance. And that is, of course, a most noble aim we all subscribe to. But is it also effective? The effect of any treatment, of course, depends on the dose that is administered. Treatment can be counterproductive or even fatal if the dose is too strong. And which in a way comes back to my last point, that is democratic criteria for selection of which parts serve to educate for a better future. And I do not primarily think here of the competition between Nazism and Stalinism, or between Holocaust or Holodomor, of which we have heard so much these last days. It just so seems, observing the kind of references used in education for peace and tolerance, never have recourse to, for instance, the example of the 14 million Germans expelled from their homes after 1945, 3 million of whom from this country. And never, so far as I can see, the murder or the expulsion of 5 million Muslims from Europe between 1855 and 1923, from places like Crimea, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece. Apparently, they are not very useful to teach tolerance and peace. We might come back to this, but basically, whatever claim we make to justify why we are in this business and why we deserve the public attention and the public money for doing the things we do, is not talking about the past for the past's sake. It is talking about the past in order to improve our present. And then, obviously, different pasts have different impacts on our present. And it might be useful to acknowledge this. I think no one of us who has been following the news the last couple of days can deny that there are major political stakes in the 20th commemoration of the genocide in Rwanda. At stake are the legitimacy of the present regime in Rwanda, the increasingly authoritarian and personal rule of Paul Kagame and his politics of memory. At stake are the social and political relations in Rwandan society today. At stake are also Rwanda's relations with its neighbors after 20 years of a lingering war that made more than 3 million deaths. Also its relations with its former colonizer, Belgium, and especially last couple of days with the protector of the former regime, the Habyarimana regime, namely France. It would, of course, and we're well placed here to observe it, be very difficult to pretend that debates on the communist past do not have instant political impact in Poland, Romania, Albania, or Ukraine. And not just the communist part, just think of all the fascists of the Maidan place. Undeniably, any discussion of the future internal order and living together of former Yugoslav republics are very much tied to discussion of Yugoslav past in the 1990s, in the 1940s, and before. Generalissimo Franco died 4 decades ago, but debates on historical legacy still profoundly divide Spanish politics and society. And I would go even so far as to say that in the case of Italy, debates on the legacy of fascism are still somehow political debates. Thank you, Mr. Berlusconi. Now, in each and every of these local contexts, social scientists and historians, museum directors, movie makers, civil servants, and politicians have a crucial role to play. They have a responsibility as citizens, as critical intellectuals, and ultimately they have a political responsibility. Now, it is much less obvious that the same is true when we are talking, for instance, of Vichy, the legacy of Vichy in France today, or the history of the Third Reich in Germany today, or the history of the Nazi occupation in places like Belgium, the Netherlands, or Norway. It is probably even less true in places where the memory of the genocide of the Jews do not correspond to any local experience. Places like, say, Sweden, the United Kingdom, or the United States of America. Here, clearly, local stakes, local debates are much less obvious. Now, yesterday the question was raised, what does it mean to belong to the next generation? And I was a little bit pained to find out that I do not belong to the next generation. I'm an old-timer. I belong to the previous generation because I did not start my university studies in 89. I finished my BA in 89, and even as a high school student, I was taken to one of these propaganda trips to West Berlin, paid by the West Berlin city government. So I'm still a relic of the Cold War, very much. But reflecting on my own trajectory and my work as a historian, I do not so much regret for being so old, but sometimes I regret that I have been too young, that I was born too late. having the impression in the kind of field I've been working on, well, that is the legacy of Nazi occupation in places like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, but it is a very long time ago that I worked on this. Well, the impression that I arrived just after the crucial battle. Konrad Adenauer might have been a great statesman and a great European, but his politics of memory, both his Vergangenheitspolitik and his Geschichtspolitik, were highly problematic. Charles de Gaulle might have been a man of considerable vision and courage, but his politics of memory were hardly any better than those of Adenauer. And there has been a heroic generation of historians in the 1970s and 1980s who have led the frontal attack against the "Wir haben es nicht gewusst." We didn't know anything of what was going on during the Third Reich. A heroic attack against the "Wir haben es nicht gewusst" of the generation in power, in government, but also in the university. That is the frontal attack against their own Dr. Vater, who had their own biographical trajectories during the Third Reich. But also a generation, for instance, who in France have utterly destroyed the myth of a France and 40 million Frenchmen engaged in the resistance. That is the politics of memory, of Gaullist France and its government of Compagnons de la Résistance. We are all heroes. Now, this was history with guts. This was a generational revolt. This was a battle for transparency. Open the archives. We want to see it. We want to see the truth and to tell the truth rather than the pious myths that are being told by those who govern us in the government and in the university. This was also, in a way, a European civil rights movement. This was about opening up spaces in national history for minority causes. The history of the Jews, but also the history of immigrants, the history of women, the history of homosexuals. All of these minority causes should be written into national history in an alliance. This was a more open history for a more open society. And that, of course, was a most challenging and noble task. It was also touching on some Cold War dogmas while the Cold War was still going on, because, of course, these stories of heroic resistance were also useful in the Cold War context of mobilizing, well, if the Russians come and if the Russians invade France, they'll meet one nation united in resistance. It was quite difficult to tell. They will meet a nation that is very, very much bent upon collaboration, and they will collaborate with the Soviets as they did with the Nazis. Don't worry. So this was very much a political battle, reclaiming history for democratic debate from its appropriation by the ruling elites against their policies of official memory. And I think it's important to underline that in this regard, there was indeed an increasing cleavage between Eastern and Western Europe. In Eastern European regimes, official dogma survived until 1989, even though it had lost all credibility by that time. But since historical narratives also provide legitimacy, well, the inability of communist regimes to revise their dogmas, well, also ultimately weakened their legitimacy and might have contributed to their downfall. Now, this battle has been fought. When I started my PhD thesis in 1990, well, there were not much taboos left to be broken. The battle had been fought courageously, and it had been won. It was an important battle, but I somehow always find it quite pathetic to see the enthusiasts of the reenactment of historical battles. Waterloo or the landing in Normandy, and we put on old uniforms and we reenact the battle. I do not think that this is the mission for historians today. We should move on to the next battle. And what could this next battle be? And I'm thinking on what we heard this morning in the panel on post-communist memories, say, well, there's a rule in the European Parliament that says that you cannot have exhibits that are controversial. So, but what's the purpose of a parliament if you cannot have controversial issues there? Well, that leads me to what ultimately turns any proposition into a political proposition. Some of you will see that I've been reading Carl Schmitt, even if that is not a reference to be mentioned very openly here. Well, what turns a proposition into a political proposition? It is because it is a partisan proposition, because it is controversial, because it divides, it creates opposition. Affirming that the Earth is a globe rather than a pancake is thus not a political proposition, except maybe in some counties in the American Bible Belt, but still. Saying that Vichy's anti-Semitic policies were its own initiative and not a concession to the German occupier is, in a comparable way, I think, today no longer a genuinely political proposition. Saying that the German population knew, approved, benefited, and participated in the Nazi racist policies is, I think, also ever less a genuinely political proposition. They are rather affirmations, I think increasingly a kind of ritual affirmation that underlines consensus rather than create division. They become a celebration of communalities. They become, indeed, a celebration of the superiority of the present over the past. The more we admit that we have been nasty in the past, the stronger we affirm that we've become very nice ever since. And we get a strange notion of time. See, on this side of the cursor, present, we have democracy, human rights, European integration. On the other side, we have world wars, totalitarianism, Holocaust, slavery, witchcraft. This is the notion. Evil is past, but the past also seems to be quite evil. And this is a way of distancing ourselves and of thereby creating a also superior present. History acts as a scarecrow. We will scare you away by teaching you history. Read a history book and close it with a sense of relief. Oh gosh, am I happy that I live in the present and not in this horrible past? History does as a lullaby, a little song that helps us to fall asleep in our comfortable present, and no longer the battle cry of a generational revolt as it had been in Germany, for instance, in the 1970s. This goes together with a culture of apology. Why was it so easy for Jacques Chirac to apologize for the participation of the French state in the deportation of the Jews? Because he didn't feel concerned at all. This was not his generation. It was not his problem. Why was it impossible for Mitterrand to do so? Well, precisely because he was concerned, because it was painful. And simply showing your moral superiority by offering apologies might be considered as a profound moral revolution. It might also be simply a facility. When Nicolas Sarkozy, as French president, requested that the farewell letter of a communist resistance fighter sentenced to death be read out aloud in all French classes, it seemed somehow obvious that the political contestation of the memory of the war years in France had reached its terminus, its final destination. There was no longer any politics in there. As we've seen, memory debates seem relevant when they are about claiming contested public space, and they stop being so when there is nothing left to be contested. But these public spaces, be it Spain or Ukraine or Serbia or Rwanda, these public spaces are primarily national public spaces. And what happens if we lift these debates on a European level? Since, as we often hear, there is not yet a fully European public space. What could the relevance be of a European politics of memory by European networks, by citizens' programs, by the recent involvement of the European Commission in its own Vergangenheitspolitik and Geschichtspolitik? And I'd like just to describe an experience that I had a couple of weeks ago. A new exhibit on the Great War opened in Brussels in the Cinquantenaire, in the Army Museum, called 14-18, c'est notre histoire. 1418, it's our history. And so the exhibit is not not stupid, it's interesting with elements of daily life, etc., of what the war did in Belgium, which was a main battlefield in an occupied country. At the end of the exhibit, we get a movie on the legacy of the Great War. And the legacy of the Great War is a history of the 20th century fast forward. So we get these black and white images of the war cemeteries, of the Versailles Treaty, of the Nuremberg party days, of the gate of Auschwitz, of the atomic mushroom in Hiroshima, of the Berlin blockade, of the tearing down of the wall. And then behind all these black and white pictures in fast forward, we get the emerging blue, the yellow stars of the European flag, and then we see Barroso and Van Rompuy receiving the Nobel Prize of Peace. I honestly think that Nicolae Ceausescu would not have dared it. The Nobel Prize of Peace. Barroso and Van Rompuy taking the stage after Nelson Mandela and Arafat. Are we kidding? What could the possible link be between 1914 and the European Union today? And I think it might be useful at some point to try to think historically. This is not just pathetic, it is probably also historically wrong. Try to ask rapidly two questions. What's the relationship between the European Union and human rights, historically? And what's the relation between the European Union and peace? Is this what European integration was all about? To bring peace and human rights? Well, first of all, European integration and human rights. There's a quote I love by Georges Bidault. Georges Bidault was a man with very firm anti-fascist credentials. He was the president of the Resistance Council in France. He became a minister in the Fourth Republic. And when the issue was, in the 1950s, whether the request by Franco-Spain to enter into the negotiations of the economic zone that was being designed by the different European communities, Bidault said, to those who said, no way, we can't admit Franco. I mean, Franco is a dictatorship. There are no fascist oranges. There are only oranges. And we don't care. European integration is about trade. It's not about fascism, anti-fascism. And in a way, Bidault was right. I invite you to read and to reread the Treaty of Rome and to try to find any reference to democracy, to human rights, or whatsoever. This is not what the Treaty of Rome is about. This is absolutely not what European integration was about in the 1950s and 1960s. There was no contractual reason to refuse Franco-Spain from the process of European integration. There was basically a two-track European integration. On the one hand, we had the Council of Europe. They were there to defend human rights. Very much about human rights, no power whatsoever. On the other hand, we had the different European communities. They had lots of power, but they were totally uninterested in human rights. It is only through a lengthy process of mobilization against the demand of Francoist Spain, and next, when the colonel seized power in Greece while the negotiations, entry negotiations were going on, that all of a sudden, European policy makers were forced to think that maybe after all, there were fascist oranges. And so, initially, there is no link whatsoever between human rights and European integration. It might also be useful today to ask the question, and what about human rights as a political agenda? And if you haven't already done so, I strongly invite you to read Sam Moyn's book on The Last Utopia. Sam Moyn says, the standard representation, the standard idea that Europe woke up from a terrible nightmare in 1945 and decided, never again, this time we go for human rights instead of war and dictatorship. Well, this isn't really how it worked. Human rights in 45, in 48, went largely unnoticed, were never really applied as a legal tool. And it's in the end only in Helsinki in 77 that human rights got some political importance and then might have contributed to 89. But between 45 and 77, the discourse on human rights was a marginal discourse. Is that sad? No, probably not, because we have to distinguish, says Moyne, between a discourse of human rights. Well, discourse on human rights is a discourse on the violations of human rights. The violations of human rights being something that happened long ago or far away. Doesn't concern us, because we are quite good at respecting human rights, but they aren't. And a different set of rights, which are civil rights. The revolutionary declaration, Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, they're not just about the negative rights of human rights, they're about political rights. They are not about suffering abroad, they are about citizenship at home. And we should also take notice that a discourse on human rights can become a very conservative, self-satisfied agenda, something like the International Criminal Court, that is a place to bring to trial Africans, but never Europeans, let alone Americans. The civil rights agenda is quite different from this negative agenda of human rights. It is about an objective alliance of minority causes. Feminists and gay activists, immigrants and racists were united in a battle for a more open society. This is a campaign for political participation, for emancipation, and for promoting political, social, economic, and cultural equality. That is much more than ensuring habeas corpus and the freedom of expression. Are the human rights really a future agenda for the European Union today? Should we praise ourselves again and again that we do not arrest or deport or kill people arbitrarily? Is that something to congratulate ourselves with again and again? Or could we have a different political agenda? Second discourse, European integration and peace. We have to choose between Verdun or Van Rompuy. Is this how it works? Here again, I think that this is historically very inadequate. There is this famous quote by Jean Monnet, who would have said by the end of his life, if I were to start all over again, I would start with a Europe of culture. Now, I don't believe that Monnet, even a single second, believed what he was saying. I mean, he was a very pragmatic, very intelligent man. Of course it didn't work. Of course European integration was not about reconciliation. It was not about, well, one lesson we draw from World War II is that henceforth we are going to love the Germans. This is not exactly how it worked. When the issue was war and peace, that is the European defense community was defeated, democratically defeated in the French and Italian parliament, because public opinion was not ready to join a new army with the German butcher, even if it was to save ourselves from a new Soviet occupation. So it is not through culture, it is not through reconciliation as such, and it is especially not through common defense that European integration started. How did it start then? Well, it started with coal, steel, agriculture. It was with building a European welfare state. And now we can say, that's a weird story. If we think of future-oriented sectors, we certainly do not think of coal, steel, and agriculture. As soon as European policies developed, it was to close down the mines, to reduce the number of farmers from 30 to 3%. I mean, this is like the neutron jack in General Motors in the 1980s. Wherever the European communities move in, you see economic sectors disappear and people being fired massively. But that, of course, is probably too simple a question. Why was it so important to take care of coal mines, of steel plants, and of agriculture? Well, it was precisely because European policies were not policies of human rights, were not policies of peace, were policies of welfare state. This was about eliminating the main source of poverty in Europe, that was subsistence farming. That was to accompany the rural crisis that had been at the heart of all the political crises in Europe. Between 1960 and 2000, between 80 and 50% of European budgets were spent on agricultural subsidies. Now that seems to be a crazy thing, especially because this was about pushing farmers to use chemicals and fertilizers on a massive scale. Why this crazy public spending on farmers? Well, after all, if more than 2/3 of European funding go to foreign policies, that is maybe one commonality between Lenin's political program and that of the European Union. That is, 2/3 is on agricultural policy. Peace, bread, and land. Well, bread and land, 2/3 of the Bolshevik program in 1917 were about the agricultural problem. The European Union is doing the same in the first half a century. And why don't we ever talk about agricultural policy? Because we think it's funny, it's certainly not sexy, it's not something, you're talking about milk and carrots. I would say, let's make a museum on milk and carrots rather than on concentration camps. That's not easy to do, but I'm not a museum maker, you are. Go ahead. But we should see, well, the true nature of European integration was this. And why was it so important? Because, well, in 1918, when universal suffrage was introduced, in some countries, 80%, places like Bulgaria, say 80% of the population were farmers. But even in France and Denmark, it was close to 30%, well, you know, in the beginning of the century, close to 50%, and by the 1950s, still 30% of the population were farmers. If we look at all the major crises that happened in Europe, the rise to power of Mussolini, triggered by the legge Visocchi, that poor peasants could seize the land of rich owners. What do these rich landowners do? They cannot call the carabinieri because the poor farmers have the right to seize the land. So they call in Mussolini and his tough gang of fascists. The Spanish Civil War is partly triggered by the Hazaña land reform, which the rich landowners do not want, and so they call back Franco from Morocco to protect their private property. So, yes, rural crisis, building up a welfare state is a central challenge in European history, and this is what European integration is about in its first years. To come to a much shorter next part of my speech, well, reclaiming the critical potential of history 25 years after 1989. I think it is very easy to see the self-satisfied narrative of 1989 at work. You guys have been living in the dark night of the past, communism, totalitarianism, Iron Curtain, and all this. Welcome into our bright present. And we've had the privilege of living in the present since 1945. Too bad for you guys, you had to wait a little bit. But don't worry, we will explain you how the present works. Welcome in the present, goodbye the past. That is a very self-satisfied narrative in Western Europe, indeed. And we could just question it on a couple of points. First of all, we didn't see it coming. Even Fukuyama wrote his article in the summer of 1989, so when it was already happening. And we didn't see it coming, and we say, well, too bad, sometimes we don't see things coming. Well, we saw the First World War coming, we saw the Second World War coming. 1989 was totally unpredicted, least of all by Ronald Reagan, who thought it was necessary to have a new arms race to force the communists to bend down. Well, that is, in a way, a spectacular failure of the social sciences, because never before had so many sociologists, political scientists, and historians been paid by their governments to be Kremlin watchers, to be Eastern Bloc watchers, and never had these social sciences been so confident in their capacity of social prognosis. We are going to predict you the future. Well, in this case, they didn't predict anything at all. It happened, and it was a divine surprise. Now you can say, okay, they didn't see it coming because they were incompetent, probably. I do not think so. Why didn't they see it coming? Well, they didn't see it coming because they had developed conceptual tools that made it impossible to see it coming. To start with, totalitarianism. Now, what is the basic idea of totalitarianism? The basic idea of totalitarianism is that there's a profound similarity between Nazism and communism. And the lesson we draw from 1945 is that we didn't see anything like 1917 happen in Nazi Germany. By the summer of 1944, it was clear that Germany was going to lose the war, and still these Germans were bent on suicide rather than on compromise. So you cannot negotiate with a totalitarian enemy, because then you get Munich, and in Munich you think you are avoiding war, what you get is a full-fledged world war. So you cannot negotiate with a totalitarian system, because there can never be internal dissent in a totalitarian system. Secret police is omnipresent, hyper-efficient. So as soon as there would be any dissident movement, it would be nipped in the bud and disappear before it can develop. So if this is the way you understand a totalitarian system, of course, you cannot see what is happening in Eastern Bloc countries. And you do not even understand what is happening in Poland in 1981. You do not understand it because you cannot understand it because you think that this is a totalitarian regime and that the only way to finish a totalitarian regime is total war, unconditional surrender. This is maybe something these social scientists could have thought about after 1989. But instead of having their session of self-criticism, they reinvented themselves as experts. We didn't see it coming, but we know how to fix it. And we call this discipline transitology. That is, we will teach you how you can join our superior present coming from the dark night of your past. So 1989 was, including afterwards, a model, this very normative model of transitology. We know how it works. This is the norm. You just try to reach our norm, okay? And our norm works perfectly for export. But we just failed to mention that, especially since the 1980s, there is quite considerable debate on these norms. Do these norms work? Do we think that our economic and political system is very healthy and is ready for export, or is it maybe time for us to rethink our political system and economic system? And so, if we think very schematically on the causes of 1989, not just as the triumph of human rights over dictatorship, deeper causes of this totally unexpected and unperceived collapse of communist regimes, we can look at economic causes. Okay. State-led reconstruction, forced industrialization, planned economy, very efficient in the 1950s and 1960s. There is this promise that Western Eastern economies are going to overtake the West. By the 1970s, this no longer works. There is stagnation. There is a failure to be flexible enough for the new kind of consumer society that is developing in the West. Standards of living start to differ ever more between the East and the West. And the way these regimes stick to power, Ceausescu, Jaruzelski, János Kadar, is through deficit spending and massive borrowing on international capital markets. So they stopped being communist economies in a way, and they entered into global capitalism. And this in the end could no longer work. The debt burden was piling up, and they were unable to earn foreign currency back through exports. Now, is this then explaining the difference between the East and the West? Maybe looked from Potsdamer Platz, West Berlin looked very wealthy, but looked from Kreuzberg or from places like Glasgow or Charleroi, the 1980s are absolutely not a moment of economic boom in Europe. It very much seemed that Europe was experiencing the same kind of problems. Industrial decline, unsustainable debt burden, crisis of the welfare state, stagnation. So there was very clearly an idea in the 1980s that the West European growth model had become dysfunctional, that this was no longer working, and that foreign debt was a big part of the problem. And just to mention, 1981 is the year of Solidarność. It's also the year of the election victory of François Mitterrand in France in an alliance with the communists. What does Mitterrand propose? Strong state intervention in the economy, nationalizing major industries and banking, deficit spending, financed through foreign loans. Now, that is quite comparable in a way, a mixture between private initiative, state intervention, and massive foreign debt. That is quite comparable to what János Kadar is trying to do in Hungary, or what Jaruzelski is trying to do in Poland. Now, what's the difference? The main difference is that Jaruzelski and Kadar can pursue a very autonomous economic policy unhindered by external constraints. Mitterrand is part of a very interdependent European economy, and he cannot have the kind of economic experiments that he wants to pursue if his German ally is not following him. So 18 months after his election victory, a very humiliating move in a way for France. France has to bow to German economic policy. And the experiment, the democratic experiment after a massive election victory, is abandoned. And it is a new European policy that in the eyes of Paris is dictated from Bonn. Now, that was a serious problem for European integration, because a great nation like France was losing its economic autonomy and had to bow in to German economic force without getting anything in return. So European integration was in dire straits in the 1980s, and it was difficult to predict where it would end up. What saved European integration in the 1980s was 1989. That is, was German unification and the bargain that was done between France, Great Britain and Germany, that in return for a German unification, which people like Thatcher and Mitterrand deeply resented, they would get monetary policy, common monetary policy. So 1989 did not put into peril European integration. It saved European integration. And as we have seen with the entry of Spain and Greece, the enlargement deepened European integration long time before it winded it. 1989 deepens European integration fundamentally 15 years before it will start to widen European integration. So, well, this is probably something we have to admit too. 1989 is also a fundamental Western European moment. Of course, there are not only economic causes, there are also political causes. What happens in 1989 is that the communist parties are washed away by popular protest. They have lost every legitimacy. So it is a crisis of the party. It's not a crisis of the state. The state, as such, continues to function. It is the party that is delegitimized. And so that's, of course, a big difference with Western Europe, where parties do not lose their legitimacy. Or do they? There is a special political constellation that emerges everywhere in Europe, that of the modern mass party. A mass party that has its youth movement, that has its trade union, it has its own newspapers, it has its own health insurance. It is a social empire. Well, that model disappears in the East in 1989, but it also enters into crisis in the 1980s in Western Europe. In Western Europe, for the first time, we get a return of the extreme right. We get the substantial loss of power of the traditional parties, Christian democracy, social democracy, and this process accelerates tremendously in the 1990s. And it is fair to say that, for instance, in Italy, by 1995, the change of political elites is much more profound than in any of the former communist countries. That is, all the old parties have disappeared, most old politicians have disappeared and have been replaced by new parties, by new politicians, and by strange constellations like a certain Silvio Berlusconi, who turns his media empire into a political party rather than the other way around. And so European politics are no longer what they used to be, and the traditional mass party has disappeared in the East and in the West. And if we go a little further, take 2002, 2002 is also symbolical for this. There we see Jean-Marie Le Pen facing Jacques Chirac in the second round of the French presidential elections. There we see in the city of Rotterdam a certain Pim Fortuyn. First time he participates in the elections, he wins 35% of the vote. While during half a century, political pluralism in the West was about coalitions, about very loyal voter behavior has become totally unpredictable. So this is not a story of incommensurable experiences in the East and the West. This is about a crisis of an economic model and a crisis of a political model, and especially of one of its main vehicles, which is the traditional mass party. And let me conclude on what I mentioned in my short summary. One of the most prevailing master narratives of 20th century Europe is probably that of the clash between democracy and its enemies. And in the end, democracy won. Good. Now, democracy is not a stable form of governance invented in 1789 and that took 2 centuries to finally triumph in 1989. Democracy is a fragile compromise of contradictory principles. What happens in 1989? 2 things at least. The people are sovereign is one proclamation, and the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Citizen and Man is another. Well, both are just 2 sides of the same coin. They're they're indistinguishable. Of course, they are not. On the one hand, we have popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, in its ultimate logic, is the right of majorities to dispose of minorities. In the French expression is la république référendaire. It is a census republic. If we have a decision to be taken, let's organize a referendum. Do we want death penalty, yes or no? Should we deport illegal immigrants, yes or no? We all instantly understand that most of us think that death penalty is not a good idea, and that it is part of a democratic heritage to be against the death penalty. But we very well know that if we organize a referendum, the death penalty comes back and with a vengeance. So somehow we have different notions of democracy than simply the brutal rule of majorities. So indeed, we do have a set of rules of individual rights which we deem to be superior to the rule of the majority. The ultimate logic of this is la République des juges. We do not need universal suffrage. We are even afraid of universal suffrage. What we need is a strong set of constitutional rules and a court to make sure that this is respected. Now, this is a strong tension that is ever present all through history and until today. On the other hand, the Universal Declaration is a universal declaration of the rights of citizens and man. It is not the French Declaration. But still, if we see what happens after 1989, it's not a universal democracy that emerges, but it is the successive reappropriation of these principles by new nation states who declare themselves to be sovereign through the experience of Napoleonic occupation until, well, the sovereignty of Kosovo in 2008. Once we admit this, we can see that we have had elements of popular sovereignty and we have had elements of constitutional rights all through history. Napoleonic Europe was certainly the triumph of constitutional rights being exported everywhere in Europe, but hardly the triumph of popular sovereignty. Certainly not in occupied Germany, Spain, Italy, etc. Fascist Italy in the 1920s came probably quite close to the incarnation of popular sovereignty, the brutal rule of a majority, but it certainly didn't respect individual rights. So we see just the poles of our conflicting notions of democracy articulated through history. And maybe that some of the popular democracies of 1948 were not that far removed from popular sovereignty, even if they were quite removed from the respect of individual rights. Now, the challenge for the European Union today, and for each and every of the democracies that compose it, is not so much to define itself negatively against the ghosts of the past, we are better than the horrors of the past, but to reinvent a new compromise between individual rights and popular sovereignty. If Europe is just a set of common norms, of negative liberties, with its metric system, its penal code and civil code like Napoleonic Europe, but unable to formulate an ambitious agenda of civil rights and of continuing to provide what has been the key to the success of European integration, that is a European welfare state, including popular sovereignty over market forces, well then the upcoming elections, European elections, might very well become the European Union's Waterloo. And that might also be a battle we do not want to reenact. Thank you.